as we do, we use this kind of imperfect little tool I just call the sermon diagnostic. It's a 3-part thing, and it doesn't do everything that to get you to good preaching, but it does kind of answer the question, is Christ and his saving work at the center of the sermon? Here it is, Rod, and I want you to tell me what you think of it. 1, how often is Jesus mentioned? Here's just the listener sitting in the pew keeping a tally on his bulletin with that little short pencil they always provide you with of how often explicitly Jesus is mentioned. Okay. Then if Jesus is mentioned, and that's not a guaranteed, by the way, because we've heard sermons without Jesus mentioned, then go on to part 2. Is Jesus the subject of the verbs? That is he the one doing the doing, driving the verbs? It's kind of a Norman Nagel kind of a question.
Sure.
And if Jesus is mentioned and he is the subject of the verbs, part 3 is, what are those verbs? Is this the Jesus that saves, dies, suffers, or is this the Jesus that helps, inspires, and motivates? What do you think of this?
Oh, it's great. I've never heard of that one before. That's great. Yeah.
What is the what's the point of kind of focusing in that narrowly on Christ and his saving work from the pew side of Christian preaching?
Well, I'm a layman now. It's what the layman actually needs, whether we know we need it or not. What we usually come there in one way or another, saying, it's such a mess this last week. I have failed so badly, and in many cases planned on doing the sinful things. I mean, it's just awful. There's just no bottom to it. Surely I'm beyond the reach now. And we come in, almost convinced that we've set ourselves forever outside Christ and his work, and hoping that the pastor has something that he can say that will speak to that. The law is killing us. And there's only one thing, according to St. Paul, that's going to meet that. And it's going to be talking about Christ and what his death does in the face of that kind of utter despair and being convinced you're right on it. Only Christ, only the message of what that cross was doing is going to have a chance of affecting it. And anything superficial, not a chance. Probably become part of the enemy, not part of the friendly forces.
Rod, the negative reaction, I get a lot of positive reaction to that, but the negative reaction I often get to that way of diagnosing Christian preaching.
There's only been one sermon 52 times a year.
Yeah. That's too simplistic. It doesn't account for the whole counsel of God.
Right.
And every sermon's going to sound the same. How do you respond to those?
Well, it's the wealth of the Bible, and this has to do with our pastor's education. It'll finally get to the laity, but first of all, to give the pastors confidence during their seminary training that the Bible's text is so wealthy in ways to approach this that it's almost infinite. You can get to that story, but it won't be the same sermon every Sunday, that's for sure, not if you do your work, because this thing is spread through hundreds of verses in different ways, and either directly didactic or in ways that point to it by story. The Bible, we will never exhaust it. Not in one lifetime of preaching we won't. Look to find the story in whatever your text is for that day.
You write about the many Christs that are often offered by Christian preachers in American pulpits, and you begin with Christ the psychotherapist. Who is this character, and why is he insufficient to save sinners like you and me?
Well, he's been one of the most popular since America went therapeutic. And first of all, let me again say something before I say any more. That is, if somebody is really a good clinician in that field, thank God for you. I don't think there are very many of you, but thank God if you're one of them, because the needs are so great. We imagine that if the church is doing its work, it's going to heal our family's mess. But that isn't really what the promise of God is in the Bible. That'd be wonderful if it spills over and does some of that, but it's not the Bible's primary subject. The Bible's primary subject is a cure for the depth of our sin. And that's the story the pastor's to stick to. If he turns Jesus into someone other than the Lamb dying for the sin of the world, it may be important, but it's not as important as what the old Lutheran fathers thought was the most important thing. The most important thing the pastor can do for me on a Sunday morning as a layman is to absolve me. Tell me God's verdict on me in light of Christ's bleeding. Is it still not guilty or isn't it? And if it isn't not guilty, what do I have to do to make it not guilty? Everything else pales before that.
Another of the false Christs you mentioned that often substitute for Christ and Him crucified is Christ our example. And people hearing this might say, wow, that doesn't sound so bad. Yeah. What's wrong with this presentation of Christ?
Because it'll drive your ship right onto the rocks. If the major message of the New Testament is copy Christ, just try it. C.S. Lewis told the story of he never thought of himself much as a sinner until one time he said, I'm going to make a decision to be less of a cad, less of a jerk. And in doing that, he started to try and work that out. And he said what he discovered were layers and layers of buried down deep sin that just astonished him. He had no idea he was going to find that. But some of us have looked down a little bit, and even a little bit, and said, good grief, there's no bottom to it in me. So an example is of no help whatever. It's more depressive, and it'll push you closer to suicide. Have the pastor say, now just go copy what Jesus did.
What happens to Christians who have the gospel given to them at the beginning and then slowly but surely withdrawn from them Sunday after Sunday, where they are basically kind of given moral teaching, but certainly not Christ and Him crucified?
Yeah, it's just tragic. If there's an underbelly to American evangelicalism, that's it. It was formed by Wesley in many ways, and the only category my Westmont kids had for preaching Christ and Him crucified was, as you mentioned, an evangelistic meeting. Now, that's great, but Paul was not sending a letter to young Timothy just instructing him on having evangelistic meetings. This was for the coming post-apostolic age, and it was going to go to the normal ministry of elders in local parishes. And so what he was saying was, Timothy, there's going to be a lot of pressure against you in doing this, but listen up. You are to placard Christ and Him crucified to the believing congregation and to do it faithfully regardless of what's opposing you. And what happens is that people become dispirited. It's sort of like a bait-and-switch thing for a car salesman and a young couple. What's presented at the evangelistic meeting is that Christ's death is enough to save. It covers their sin with regard to the holy God, and it will save them. It is sufficient to die with this. But then, if the message every single Sunday has to do with our improvement as Christians, it's really the category of law. And it will, because our intuition is already telling us this, it will strengthen that intuition to where the really sensitive person can despair and say, I thought I was a believer, but it must be that I'm not really a believer because this thing isn't working. I'm not getting better.
We have many listeners to this program who have told the same story over and over again. They've said, I've been in these churches where it was all about the higher life, it was all about self-improvement, about making moral progress and all those things. That was a strong emphasis. Occasionally, they did mention that Jesus' death was enough to save sinners, maybe even every sinner, but it was not the normal fare. And they reached this point of complete desperation. They went searching someplace else. They happened, but just by happenstance, maybe to tune into this show or to stumble into a church where Christ is being preached every Sunday to every sinner. And they say this, Rod, and it's remarkable. They say, I never heard it that way before.